Well, here we are in the pretty Cheshire village of Farndon, and we're on the trail looking for the birthplace of one of the most enigmatic, charismatic and iconic footballers ever to pull on a Goalkeepers jersey. Now, he wasn't a household name by any means, but he hasn't been forgotten. But before the First World War, he was one of the most famous men in the country. Well, that didn't take long. That was England, and this is Wales. And we're now entering the village of Holt. So here we are at the birthplace of Leigh Richmond Roose. Now, Leigh was the son of a Presbyterian minister in the village, and the Presbyterian church is right alongside. And the house is called the Manse. His father, who was Richmond Leigh Roose, he was born in Anglesey, but he had a similar position in a church in Hay-on-Wye. And there he had a family, married, he had 3 sons, and then he moved here. And the year that he moved here, that's when Leigh was born. And he also had a daughter a short time afterwards, but his wife became very ill during that time. And she unfortunately died of cancer, and Leigh was only 4 years old. Now, during his youth, he and his brothers were educated just over the road here at Holt Academy. Now, this was a school for young men for around the district. It was boarders as well, although that didn't apply to Leigh, of course. But one of the teachers here in the late 1800s was quite a famous man in his own right. Now, I've got a book here that was given to me when I was about 9 by my uncle. And I love this book. And you just open the first page and story the first, The Time Machine. That might give you a clue who this actually was. But he didn't like it here at all. In fact, he wasn't impressed with Holt whatsoever. And if he turned to his own words, from the first few weeks, I knew I should have to escape from this flat, grey, desolate land, the dirty school and its Presbyterian habits. Holt turned out to be a squalid, ill-run travesty of the word academy, where boys slept 3 in a bed, lessons took place with the uncertainty of April showers, and downright disorder threatened with such persistence that the headmaster freely advocated in private the physical punishment that he abhorred in public. Well, in fact, quite a lot of the timetable was filled up with football. And our poor writer there had to endure being a referee for most of those games, and he absolutely hated it. And in fact, in one of those games, Leigh Roose's brother Edward is supposed to have gone in quite hard on him. Why he's going in hard on a referee, we can only surmise. Maybe the boys have put a contract on him. But he badly injured his kidney, which took several weeks to heal. And at the end of that, he left. He went back down south. And of course, he then became the writer that we all know. It was none other than H.G. Wells, the writer of books like The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, and of course, The War of the Worlds. As the son of a Presbyterian minister, his father was keen to see that Leigh went into a profession, and medicine was going to be that chosen route. He was able to matriculate into Aberystwyth University, and that's where his career went next. While at Aberystwyth University, he turned out for the university side. But he was soon picked up by Aberystwyth Town. Quite a bit of success there. They won all 3 Welsh Cup competitions with him. And he also received his first Welsh international call-up. But he was still keen to continue with his career in medicine, and he moved to King's College Hospital in London. And while he was there, he signed up for London Welsh. Now, that's a rugby club, a famous rugby club, but they did have a football team there as well. And so he was, again, quite successful there. And he soon came to the attention of a number of clubs. And Stoke City were the first to sign him. He made a number of appearances there, had a successful time, a number of clean sheets as well. But he retained his amateur status at a time when the bigwigs in the league were trying to get players to turn professional. But he played for expenses, which by all accounts seems to be astronomical. You maybe take a share of the gate or whatever arrangement that they came to. So that would cause upset at various clubs that he went to. And that was one of the reasons why he left Stoke. He was then picked up by Everton. We were in the 1904-1905 season. It looked like we were on for the double. We were top of the league in January. And it looked like it was plain sailing. We got to the semi-final of the FA Cup. And our regular goalkeeper, Scott, was injured. So Leigh Roose was there. He was available. And so he was signed. But everything sort of imploded.
As the 1904-05 season was drawing to a close, there were crucial games against Manchester City and Arsenal, but they were compacted. The timescale was so tight, and this was a crucial time when they could have won the league. Now, they played Man City on Friday the 23rd of April, where they lost 2-0, and Leigh Roose's best friend, Billy Meredith, Wales, he had a field day there. Then they had to travel straight down to London, as just hours later on the following day, they had another crucial game against Arsenal, which they lost 2-1. Well, that was too much for Roose, who confronted William Cuff about it, who really didn't take kindly to his authority being questioned. He accused Roose of hypocrisy, as he himself had turned out for Wales as late as the 8th of April in Belfast during this run-in, when he should have been playing for Everton against Stoke, Billy Scott having to deputise. Well, Cuff, in reaction, dropped Roose for the final game against Notts Forest. I mean, it was a nothing game, really, as the league had already been decided. But nevertheless, he was incensed, as he'd never been dropped before. As things started to smooth over a bit, Roose regretted his actions, and he wrote Cuff a letter of apology. And almost immediately after that last game, Everton left for a successful tour of Austria. And it seems, while they were over there, everybody seemed to be getting on well enough. This is all before the end of April, and it seems to have all been smoothed over. But word got out that had been disquiet, and it was reported in the press on the 1st of May. By the 3rd of May, we know that Harry Ousterbury, who was the Stoke manager, he sent Roose a telegram asking if he fancies returning to Stoke. And Roose replied almost immediately, again by telegram, just 2 words, glad to. Now, the Everton board seemed completely unaware by this. And as far as they're concerned, they intended to retain his services, and he's recorded in the board minutes on their list as such, which is signed and authorised by Cuff. He clearly had no issues and wanted him to stay. Well, on the 20th of June, a delegation travelled to Stoke to secure a permanent deal, as it seems he's still under contract at Stoke. He'd been on loan. So on the 20th of July, the board instructed the players that they were due to reconvene for training on the 9th of August. And the following day, there'd be the annual picnic, ironically, to Farndon and Holt. And this tradition, in fact, went back to at least 1892, which immediately preceded the opening fixtures of Goodison Park. You think it would have been nice for Roose to have shown his teammates where he was born and the village where he lived. By early August, Everton still think he's going to be on their books for the forthcoming season, which is only a few weeks away. The beginning of the season is September then. But still waiting for confirmation, the club send another delegation to London to meet Roose, but they return without their man, and which is reported to the board on the 14th of August. By the 17th, the board received a letter in which Roose states tersely that his decision to resign from Everton is final. Everton had blown their chance of retaining the best keeper in the land, although they still had the very able Billy Scott to fall back on, who stayed at the club for another 7 years, racking up 251 appearances and 24 caps for Ireland. By the 23rd of August, the press and Stoke were reporting that Roose had decided to give up football entirely, as he couldn't cope with all the travelling while still working at the hospital and continuing his studies there. It was all smoke and mirrors. I mean, to the astonished Everton board, Roose confirmed on the 26th of August he'd be returning to Stoke and made his second debut for them on Saturday the 2nd of September.
He had 2 years there, again, successful time. But then he broke his wrist, which put him out the game for a short time. After his recovery, he then moved up to Sunderland, one of the big clubs of the day. And again, a successful time there as well. But what about him as a player? I mentioned earlier that he was this enigmatic guy. I mean, no one had seen the like of him. I mean, he was a really big man, very tall, big build, very strong. And this was the time when the tactics quite often was a kick and rush on the goalkeeper, where you'd have the strikers, one going in to take out the goalkeeper and the other one to put the ball in the net. Now, Roose was unusual because he gave as good as he got, and would often come out of the melee, with the ball ready to launch it upfield. Or, in fact, he would quite often take the ball up to the halfway line. Now, in those days, different rule, and the goalkeepers were able to handle it right up to the halfway line. So you had to bounce it. So it's rather like basketball where he'd be bouncing it away, But that's how he would start an attack, And not all goalkeepers took advantage of that, but he did. And so, defences lived in fear of him. He was quite an imposing figure, whichever team that he played for. But there are other stories about him as well. He was the most illegible bachelor of the time. They said after Jack Hobbs, I think they put him before him. But he was getting national fame because of that. He was always seen with a girl on his arm, and one of them was Marie Lloyd. She was a famous musical star of the day. Now you may not know her name because it's so long ago, before the First World War. But you probably know one of her famous songs, which is "My Old Man Said Follow the Van and Don't You Dilly Dally on the Way." So he was certainly a man about town in London in those days. I suppose a bit like Beckham of his day, dapper suits, all that sort of thing. But he was certainly quite a character. I think he thought he could probably get away with anything at the time. For example, he was living in London in those days, continuing to play up at Sunderland and Stoke and so on. But he was late for a particular game, and he got to the station in London and just hired a train. There seems to be always a train ready for rich people, in case they wanted a train of their own back in those days. And that's what he did. He would just hire the train and then set off. But in this particular case, he actually charged it to the club. So again, he fell out with the board over that as well, and that was the end of his time there. But he was so charismatic as a footballer, and people would go along just to see him. He was such an amazing guy. For example, he would come out of the changing rooms and he would head to the centre circle, and he would bow to each side of the ground and wave to everybody, which was not the done thing at the time. During the game, he'd be chatting to the crowd behind the goal, telling jokes, all that sort of thing, signing autographs. He was even known to swing on the crossbar. I mean, there were some stories that actually sat on the crossbar. Maybe he did, but he was that type of character, really an enigmatic player. I mean, he was such a hero to a lot of people as well at the time. So while at Sunderland, unfortunately, he broke his wrist again. That was 1910, and that effectively put him out of top-flight football. He pottered around with one or two other clubs. He played for Aston Villa, made one or two appearances there. He went to Celtic, played a game there, Huddersfield. But it just wasn't the same. And he also started to get involved in after-dinner speaking as well. He wrote a column for local sports magazines and so on. Effectively, his career by that stage, around 1911, it was really on the wane, and he retired. Now, Leigh also had a prolonged international career from 1900 to 1911. And this is at a time, of course, when there were not many internationals. They're the home internationals, but there were not a great deal many fixtures apart from that. He played 24 games. There was a well-known game in 1906, and this is Wales v Ireland. And the reason it's well known, still now, is because it was filmed by Mitchell and Kenyon, the pioneers of film photography at the time. In fact, they were well known for filming Everton's first game on film. That was in 1902, a game against Newcastle at Goodison Park. But that game in 1906, that still exists. That film is still there, and you can find that online.
In 2006, Vanessa Tomlin, curator of the Mitchell and Kenyon collection, gave an interview about the value of the film that we have of Leigh Roose keeping goal for Wales against Ireland in March 1906. She said, "In terms of its historical significance, the film is absolutely priceless, being the earliest surviving footage of an international football match that we know of. What has survived is in such perfect condition that it looks as though it was filmed yesterday. It contains all the elements we associate with more advanced football coverage, such as the teams running out on the pitch, the action, and the reaction of the crowd. We think shots of weeping Geordies and Scousers of football matches is a relatively new thing, and Mitchell and Kenyon's footage tells us it's not. The only real disappointment is that Billy Meredith is missing from the action, because he was suspended at the time and couldn't play. But Leigh Roose is there, captured for posterity. One thing you can really begin to appreciate by watching the film is how much danger the goalkeepers were in at the time. Mitchell and Kenyon always liked to film corners being taken because they could almost guarantee where the action was about to take place. As a result, they recorded many goalkeepers being physically battered by opposing players. It's hardly surprising that so many of them feared catching the ball, preferring instead to try and punch it clear.
So here we are at Wrexham's racecourse ground, and just behind me here you can see there's a plaque being put up. This is to commemorate that film that was made by Mitchell and Kenyon back in 1906. This was unveiled by John Toshak, who was one time manager of Wales, of course. So this was put up in 2006, and they had a commemorative football match to go along with that as well. And they've actually chosen one of the players to appear on the plaque. And who would it be? Well, of course, it had to be Leigh Roose. And here you can see his image on the plaque. And he's described as being a social phenomenon, not only an excellent goalie, but also a nationally famous playboy. The First World War began on the 4th of August 1914. Not long afterwards, Leigh Roose signed on for the Royal Army Medical Corps, going in as a medic to capitalise on his skills and his training at home. A short time afterwards, he was posted out to France at a ruin where there was a hospital there behind the lines, treating the wounded as they were being brought out. But a short time afterwards, he was posted to Gallipoli. The Gallipoli campaign was a kind of a diversion because a stalemate had started to occur on the Western Front. It was decided by the powers that be that they would open up this other front on this side here, and you can see here where the Dardanelles are. And the idea was to be able to get through here to open up the supply lines and cause a diversion here to the enemy forces. And so the landings took place here on the Gallipoli Peninsula here in the Dardanelles. And that's where he was posted to, again, doing the same thing with not as a frontline soldier, but behind the lines, working in the Royal Army Medical Corps. But the whole action was disastrous. And even with the added forces of the Anzacs, the Australians and the New Zealanders and other allied forces, they still couldn't overwhelm the Turkish forces on the higher ground. So the decision was then made by the end of the year to pull all the forces out, largely to Egypt, and then they'd be shipped home. Now it's at this point where the family believe that Leigh Roose had lost his life. But there were letters coming out, and he was writing to his best friend, or one of his close friends, who was George Holly, the Sunderland forward, who also played for England. And he wrote,
If ever there was hell on this occasionally volatile planet, then this oppressively hot, dusty, diseased place has to be it. If I've seen the fragments of one plucky youth whose body, or what the remains of it, has been swollen out of all proportion by the sun, I've seen several hundred. The bombardment is relentless, to the extent you become accustomed to its tune, a permanent rat-a-tat-tat complemented by bursting shells. And yet at night the stars are so bright in this largest of skies that one cannot help but be pervaded with a feeling of serenity as peculiar as that appears.
After his posting to the 9th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, they were already out there. They'd been out on the Somme for some time. So Leigh's contingent was sent out there to bolster the losses. And they were based around this area here, Pozières, which is right in the heart of the Somme. And so the British lines that were here were gradually pushing forward here. And on the night of the 4th of August, they had taken 5th Street here and 4th Street. So largely this area here, they'd moved into here. Now, while there, the next objective was going to be Ration Trench. And so that's the line that's going up here. You just see it there. And they were waiting to go into action, and sitting in the trenches, and finally the order came through, and over they went. But they were split up at one stage, and the communication wasn't good in the heat of the battle. But eventually they did capture the trench. The following night, the Germans mounted a counter-attack, and that is when they advanced, and they were using a flamethrower, a Flammenwerfer. It's in this action that Leigh was heavily involved, and he's recorded in the London Gazette as follows. Private Leigh Roose, who had never visited the trenches before, was in the sap when the Flammenwerfer attack began. He managed to get back along the trench, and although nearly choked with fumes and with his clothes burnt, refused to go to the dressing station. He continued to throw bombs until his arm gave out, and then, joining the covering party, used his rifle with great effect. So that was published in the London Gazette of the 21st of September 1916. Now, this is an amazing achievement. I mean, this was his first experience of trench warfare. And for this, he was awarded the Military Medal, which is a high-ranking award for bravery. An astonishing achievement. And he was also promoted to Lance Corporal. So on revisiting the battlefield early this year, we were standing on the point of the windmill, or the ruins of the windmill, which is actually marked on here. And looking across the landscape, we could see the area here where those trenches were, where Ration Trench was, where this action took place. So after that action during August, they were then pulled behind the lines to have a period of rest and respite. And by the end of September, they were pushed back into line again. By the 7th of October, they were ready to go into the trenches at the front line. Now we see here, this is an area just to the northeast of Pozières, and it continues the front line here. And we've got Goudecourt here, and Le Sart here, and this action is going to go to press the enemy back again. And so they'd already captured these Gerd trenches here, which were the German lines. And they're then going to press on again. And the 9th were tasked with attacking Bayonet Trench, which is just here. And so they were ready 1:45 p.m. in the afternoon of the 7th. That was the hour when they were going to go over the top. And when they did, unfortunately, the Germans had another party coming in to relieve the men who were already there. And so consequently had about double the men in the trenches at that time. So they mounted an intense attack of a machine gun fire. And it's during that period that we think, during that action, we think that Leigh Roose lost his life as he was rushing forward with the rest of the battalion to take Bayonet Trench. So somewhere in this area, it would appear that's where Roose was killed. The key issue here, of course, is that his body was never recovered, and that's happened to thousands and thousands of men. But he's now 38 years old. He's been suffering from trench foot, and yet eyewitnesses did see him rushing forward to try and take this trench. Gordon Hoare, for example, an amateur England international before the war, witnessed Roose running across no man's land at full pelt towards the enemy, firing his rifle as he went. So there was an eyewitness who did actually see him. There are other eyewitnesses, but they're rather unreliable. So on revisiting the battlefields, we have Bayonet Trench here, and it crosses the D10, the modern D10 here, and that's just near Goudecourt. So if we were to just look at that modern scene now, it looks like that. So it's somewhere there where Leigh lost his life. So unfortunately, he may have been blown to bits, or he may very well be still lying there below ground. Who knows? So here we are in the churchyard of St Chad's in Holt, the parish churchyard, as opposed to the Presbyterian church, which doesn't have a churchyard there. The tragedy of this for the family is that they had no idea what had happened to Leigh during the war. They didn't know whether he was missing, whether he was killed in action, whether he'd survived, and at some stage in 1918 he walked through the door. They had no idea, and sadly he was in that state that his father died in 1917 after 40 years service in the village of Holt at the age of 79. It's not just his father who is laid to rest here, but his brother Edward as well. And we've only recently discovered this, but it's if I just walk to the back here, we've just uncovered his grave, and this is it here. So as you can see, it's been difficult to rediscover. We always knew it was in the churchyard, and it was once a standing stone, but it's been covered over in moss and leaves for many years. But clearly this is his grave, and it says here Edward Bradley Roose of the manse Holt. The death of Edward hit Leigh particularly hard. Leigh had travelled up from Aberystwyth to go to Liverpool for a match against University College, and Edward had gone over there as well to see him, but the weather was really bad, and Edward had got absolutely drenched, and the beginnings of a cold had developed. And by the time the two brothers got back to Holt, he was really unwell. They had a family get-together, an evening meal, but Edward then took to his bed. Leigh returned to Aberystwyth, but Edward never recovered, and he died a few days later on the 29th of May. He was aged just 21. So we've now come into the church of St Chad's, and we're looking at the, it's not exactly a war memorial. This is the men who served from the parish. We do have included on here is William Roose here. This is the older brother of Leigh Roose, who did serve, but I don't think he actually went abroad. Nevertheless, he still served in the army at the time. But no mention of Leigh Roose on here. So at the time when they put this up, they had no idea what had happened to him. It still wasn't confirmed as to whether he was missing or killed in action, or in fact he'd survived. Now William did survive the war, so we can see this isn't just a memorial. As far as the family were concerned, Leigh seems to have perished on the battlefields at Gallipoli, because nothing more was heard about him. Bear in mind that the father had died in 1917, so it was largely left to Helena and his sister to try and track down what had actually happened to him. She contacted the powers that be, the War Office, various organisations, to try and see if they had any records on him at all. But there was absolutely nothing whatsoever. And it was actually after the end of the war, where she was attending a function at Twickenham after an international game between England and Wales, her husband being an international rugby player. And there they were sat round with a few VIPs there, and the conversation actually turned to Leigh Roose, and people saying how sad it was and no one knew what had happened to him and so on. And then one of the guests there, a guy called Tom Webster, who was a cartoonist for a newspaper, he actually said, "Oh no," he said, "I saw him. He was playing cricket in Egypt." Now, this is where everyone had been pulled out, so evacuated to after the campaign. So clearly he'd survived. Well, this hit them like a bombshell. I mean, what had happened? Where was he? Had he come home? So the mystery deepened again. Still, after appeals, nothing was coming up. There were one or two eyewitnesses, of course, and then we hear about people who'd seen him at Bayonet Trench, so they had that to go on. But actually, to find his record anywhere, even the Royal Fusiliers had no record of a Leigh Richmond Roose. But it transpired that his name had been spelt wrong. It was a clerical error, and the second O in his name had come out as a U. So Roose sounds the same, but the problem is when you're indexed amongst thousands and thousands of men, he wasn't coming up at all on the searches, and that was the reason that the family and everybody else just couldn't find him. Now, his name was actually recorded on a war memorial, and it's probably the most famous war memorial, and that is the LCpl Memorial, which we can see here. The memorial was constructed between 1928 and 32, and it was designed by Edward Lutyens, who's also well known for the cenotaph in Whitehall. But when you come up to view this, it's an incredible place. It dominates the landscape. It's quite overwhelming as you walk up towards it. So once it was learned that there was a clerical error, things started to snowball, and the documents were then looked up under Roose with a U, and sure enough there are records, and he's listed there. But of course you want the correct name, and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission need precise evidence to link the name with the man, and it took them some years and a lot of campaigning by people like Spencer Vignes, well known for his book, and other historians who put the pressure on and tried to provide as much evidence as they could. So eventually in 2016, that's what happened. They did acknowledge that he was one and the same, and the name was changed in the records. The only problem is that when it's on a panel, and the panel is actually quite high up, I can remember going and seeing it when it was spelt with a U, and having to view it at quite a distance. They said it wasn't until the panel had deteriorated where they could take that out and replace it. But in actual fact, revisiting it now, and you can see that panel, and we were there early on this year, and you can see that panel has now been changed, so the correct name is actually on there. He was also added to the Aberystwyth University Memorial there, where the Old Students Association added a plaque with his name on. In contrast to the plaque we saw in St Chad's in Holt, Leigh is recorded on the Presbyterian Church Roll of Honour, where his father was minister, together with his brother William. Leigh's name is marked with an asterisk, denoting those who had fallen. This wooden framed roll now resides in Wrexham Museum. Another of the war memorials that Leigh Roose's name now appears is probably the most well known to Everton fans, because we're here at the Park End stand. It's Goodison Park. And you can see that this is the war memorial in place. It's been here since 2011, put in place by the Everton Shareholders Association. And of course, we think of the date of 2011, we haven't waited, Everton Heritage Society researchers haven't waited for that confirmation from the Commonwealth War Graves. We knew he was missing, and so he rightfully deserved his place on this war memorial. And his story can be found in the Fallen of Everton booklet, and we can see here a short amount of text a photograph. And this booklet is available for download on the Everton Heritage website. Personally, I take no credit for the research on much of this, although I knew about Leigh Roose and his career in general before we started this. I knew that quite a few years ago, but not to the depth that I know now. And I have to say, I owe that entirely to this book, Lost in France, on Leigh Richmond Roose by Spencer Vignes. And it's a superb book. I think this is easily my favourite book on football. I think it's an amazing book. And he looks at the career of this player, this charismatic player that he describes in great detail. Not only that, Spencer in his book solves a mystery that's been unsolved for over 100 years. So here we are back in the place of Roose's birthplace, the village of Holt, and behind me at the Village War Memorial. It's been quite a journey. From here he went to Aberystwyth, he went to South Wales, on to London, playing football in Stoke, then up to Sunderland, to Everton of course. He had time elsewhere, such as Aston Villa, Celtic, and then the battlefields where he was over in the Gallipoli campaign, being evacuated back to Egypt, and then of course the battlefields in France. But it's here he's finally recorded on the Village War Memorial. Just behind me you can see Lance Corporal Leigh Roose, Leigh Richmond Roose, military medal. This prince of goalkeepers has finally come home.